Tonight, we will explore a teaching that reveals how our choices create invisible threads connecting us to our fate. The Buddha taught that what we do in secret writes itself upon our hearts, and what we hide from others becomes visible to the world in ways we never expect. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, no one you need to become as we explore these ancient stories together. If this path of gentle wisdom calls to you, I invite you to subscribe to join our community of seekers who find peace through these timeless teachings. Tonight, we will discover how the universe holds perfect accounts, how small compromises create great collapses, and how the seeds we plant in darkness always bloom in daylight. Let us begin this journey together. Take a gentle breath and feel your body settling into this moment. Notice how the air moves through you, carrying away the concerns of the day. Let your breathing soften, allowing each exhale to release what you no longer need to hold. Let us explore the story of the merchant's ring and see what it teaches about promises made and broken. There once lived a merchant named Tarun in a prosperous trading town where the mountain roads met the river routes. He was known for his skill in acquiring fine goods from distant lands, silk from the east, spices from the southern kingdoms, silver and copper from mountain mines. His shop occupied the corner of the main square, its windows displaying treasures that made people pause and dream. Tarun had married young to a woman named Mira, daughter of another merchant family. Their marriage had been arranged, but love had grown between them, like morning light spreading across still water. Mira had gentle hands and a quick mind for numbers. She helped manage their growing wealth while Tarun traveled the trading routes. On the morning before his longest journey yet, a 6-month expedition to the coastal kingdoms, Tarun visited the silversmith. He commissioned a ring, simple but beautifully crafted, engraved with symbols of fidelity and return. The silversmith was an old man whose hands moved like water over metal, shaping it as if the silver itself wanted to become what he envisioned. "Make it strong," Tarun requested, watching the smith work. "It must last through all kinds of weather, through dust and rain, through the heat of southern summers and the chill of mountain passes." The silversmith smiled, his weathered face creasing. "Silver remembers everything that touches it, young merchant. It will change with what it experiences, showing on its surface what lives in the heart of the one who wears it." Tarun barely listened to these words, focused instead on the beauty of the emerging ring. When it was finished, he placed it on his finger before Mira, speaking words of promise. "This ring binds me to you across any distance. While I wear it, I am yours alone, and you are never far from my thoughts. When you see me return wearing it, you will know I have kept faith with our love." Mira touched the ring gently, feeling its smooth warmth. "It suits you," she said. "Wear it well and come home safely." The first weeks of Tarun's journey passed exactly as he had envisioned. He traveled with a caravan of 12 other merchants, their pack animals loaded with goods for trade. The ring caught sunlight as he gestured during negotiations, and he found himself looking at it often, remembering Mira's face and the promises he had made. In the first major trading city, Tarun's business went exceptionally well. He acquired rare shells and pearls at prices better than he had hoped. The local merchants respected his fair dealing and invited him to their evening meals. He spoke often of his wife, showing the ring proudly, explaining its meaning to anyone who would listen. But in the second city, something shifted. The trading days were longer, the negotiations more complex. Tarun found himself staying weeks longer than planned, living in a merchant's quarter filled with travelers from many lands. Here, far from home, surrounded by strangers who knew nothing of his life, old certainties began to feel distant. There was a woman in this city, the daughter of a wealthy spice merchant. She had dark eyes and an easy laugh, and she helped her father with trades. She was unmarried, her father explained, because she was too particular, too intelligent for the local men. When she looked at Tarun's ring and asked about his wife, he found himself describing Mira as if she were a distant acquaintance rather than his beloved. "You seem lonely," the woman observed one evening as they walked through the city's garden quarter after completing a large transaction. Marriage to someone far away must be difficult. Tarun felt the ring on his finger, but for the first time, it seemed heavy rather than comforting. Sometimes a man makes promises when he is young that he doesn't fully understand, he said, surprising himself with these words. That night, in his room at the Traveler's Inn, Tarun twisted the ring on his finger and stared out at the strange city's lights. He had not broken his promise. He had only spoken to the woman, only felt the stirring of attraction. But something in his heart had already shifted, and when he looked at the ring in the lamplight, it seemed to him that its silver gleam had lost some of its brightness. The third city brought greater temptations and weaker resistance. Here, Tarun met a widow who managed her late husband's textile business with remarkable skill. She was beautiful and intelligent, living alone in a fine house with servants and gardens. She invited the visiting merchants to elegant dinners where wine flowed freely and conversation ranged from poetry to politics. "You have kind eyes," she told Tarun one evening when they found themselves alone on her garden terrace. "I imagine your wife is fortunate to have such a thoughtful husband." The ring felt tight on Tarun's finger. He found himself lying easily, naturally. "My wife and I have an understanding," he said. "She knows that a traveling man has different needs than one who stays home. We trust each other to be discreet." The widow smiled. "How modern of you both. How wise." That night, Tarun removed the ring for the first time since leaving home, placing it on the table beside his bed. When he picked it up in the morning, he noticed that its surface had darkened slightly, as if tarnished by night air. He polished it with his sleeve, but the brightness did not fully return. Days became weeks in that city. Tarun told himself he was waiting for the best season to continue his journey. But really, he was lost in the pleasure of living without accountability, of being unknown and therefore free. The widow was sophisticated and understanding, expecting nothing permanent, offering warmth without demands. When Tarun finally continued his journey, he carried guilt like a stone in his chest. But distance made the guilt smaller, and by the time he reached the coastal kingdoms where the best trading opportunities awaited, he had convinced himself that what had happened in the third city was an aberration, a moment of weakness that would never be repeated. The coastal kingdoms were everything he had hoped. The markets overflowed with goods he had only heard described: rare woods that smelled of distant forests, fabrics woven with threads of gold, gems that captured light like trapped rainbows. His negotiations were brilliant, his profits beyond his most optimistic projections. But the nights were long and lonely in a land where he knew no one and understood only fragments of the local language. He found companionship where traveling merchants always had, in the quarter of the city where women made their living providing comfort to strangers far from home. At first, Tarun told himself these encounters meant nothing. They were transactions, business arrangements no different from buying grain or copper. But loneliness and rationalization worked together, and soon he was visiting the same woman regularly, a young mother who had been widowed young and had few other ways to feed her children. She was kind and gentle, asking no questions about his life, accepting his payment gratefully. She noticed his ring and asked about it once. "It's just decoration," Tarun said, twisting it nervously. "A piece of jewelry I liked in a market somewhere." But when he looked at the ring later that evening, he saw that its silver surface had darkened noticeably. What had been bright metal was now dull gray, and no amount of polishing could restore its original luster. The symbols of fidelity engraved on its surface seemed to mock him, growing harder to see as the tarnishing deepened. Tarun told himself the ring was reacting to the sea air, to the different climate of the coastal region. Silver was a soft metal, prone to tarnishing. It meant nothing. But deep in his heart, he remembered the silversmith's words. Silver remembers everything that touches it, showing on its surface what lives in the heart of the one who wears it. The final months of Tarun's journey passed in a haze of profitable trading and guilty pleasures. He moved from city to city, port to port, accumulating wealth and compromising his integrity with equal efficiency. In each place, he found reasons to justify his behavior: the loneliness of travel, the customs of foreign lands, the understanding that what happened far from home need never affect his marriage. But the ring grew darker with each betrayal, its silver surface turning from gray to black, the engraved symbols disappearing entirely under the tarnish. By the time Tarun began his journey home, the ring looked like a band of charcoal around his finger. He tried everything to clean it. He bought compounds from metalworkers, acids from alchemists, polishing cloths from jewelers. Nothing worked. The blackness seemed to come from within the metal itself, as if the silver had been transformed into something else entirely. As his caravan approached the mountain passes that would lead him home, Tarun grew desperate. He considered throwing the ring away, claiming he had lost it somewhere on the journey. But that would be another lie, and somehow he knew that lying about the ring would be worse than wearing it blackened. He considered having it replaced, commissioning a new ring identical to the original. But the thought of facing the same old silversmith who had warned him about silver's memory filled him with dread. And besides, Mira would notice. She had an eye for detail, a memory for the things that mattered. The closer he came to home, the more the ring seemed to weigh on his finger. It was as if the metal had become heavier as it darkened, pulling his hand down, making him constantly aware of its presence. Sometimes he caught himself staring at it, wondering if other people could see what he saw, if his shame was as visible to others as it was to him. 2 days from home, Tarun stopped at a mountain temple where travelers often rested and made offerings for safe journeys. The temple was old and peaceful, built around a natural hot spring where pilgrims had come for centuries to purify themselves. An elderly monk tended the temple, a man whose face showed the deep peace that comes from years of meditation and service. He welcomed Tarun warmly, offering tea and a place by the fire where the merchant could rest and warm himself. As they sat together in comfortable silence, the monk noticed Tarun twisting the ring on his finger, his face troubled. "That ring causes you distress," the monk observed gently. Tarun looked down at his hand, surprised to realize he'd been fidgeting with the ring unconsciously. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "Just a piece of jewelry that has tarnished from travel." The monk studied the ring carefully, then looked into Tarun's eyes with the kind of direct gaze that seemed to see through all pretenses. "May I see it more closely?" he asked. Reluctantly, Tarun extended his hand. The monk examined the ring without touching it, leaning forward slightly, his expression growing more thoughtful. "This was silver once," the monk said. "Beautiful silver, carefully crafted. The engraving was skillful, symbols of promise and fidelity, if I'm not mistaken." Tarun felt his face flush. "Yes, it was a gift to myself when I married. And now it has changed," the monk continued calmly. "Silver is remarkable in how it responds to what it experiences. Unlike gold, which remains unchanged by almost anything it encounters, silver is sensitive, reactive. It shows the truth of what touches it." "You're saying the ring has blackened because of something I did?" Tarun's voice was defensive, but underneath the defensiveness was fear. The monk was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire dance in the temple's central hearth. "I am saying that silver cannot lie," he finally said. "It shows what is. A ring that was made to symbolize faithfulness will reflect faithfulness, or its absence. The metal remembers not just what touches it from outside, but what flows through the heart of the one who wears it." Tarun stared at the ring, his throat tight. "So you think I deserve this? You think the ring is punishing me?" Let us pause here for a gentle breath. Feel the air moving through you, carrying away tension with each exhale. Notice how your body rests against whatever supports you. There is nothing to do in this moment but be here, breathing softly, letting these ancient teachings settle into your heart like seeds in fertile ground. We will continue with Tarun's story, but first, let us explore another tale that reveals how the choices we make in secret always find their way into the light. There lived in a prosperous grain trading region a man named Bharat, whose position as the regional grain inspector made him one of the most important people in 7 villages. When harvest came each year, farmers would bring their grain to the central storehouse, and Bharat would test it for quality, moisture, and signs of mold or rot. His approval stamp meant the difference between a family eating through the winter or going hungry. Bharat had held this position for 12 years, appointed originally for his keen eye and incorruptible reputation. He could detect the slightest hint of mold, could judge moisture content by the feel of grain between his fingers, could spot the tricks some farmers tried to use to hide inferior crops within good ones. The work was seasonal, but well paid. During harvest time, Bharat worked from dawn to dusk, examining wagon after wagon of grain. During the rest of the year, he managed the great stone storehouse where the approved grain waited to be distributed during times of need or sold to traders from other regions. For his first 8 years, Bharat took pride in his absolute honesty. He rejected grain that was even slightly questionable, understanding that his standards protected not just the storehouse reserves, but the health of everyone who might eventually eat what he approved. His reputation spread throughout the region. Grain stamped by Bharat was considered the finest available. But in the 9th year, everything changed. A drought had damaged crops throughout the region, and harvest yields were far below normal. Desperate farmers arrived at the storehouse with grain that was marginal at best, too moist, showing early signs of mold, mixed with chaff and inferior seeds. Under normal circumstances, Bharat would have rejected most of these loads, sending farmers home to dry their grain properly or accept lower prices for animal feed rather than human consumption. But the regional administrator had made it clear that the storehouse needed to maintain certain minimum reserves, and the farmers faced genuine hardship if their crops were rejected. On a gray morning late in harvest season, a wealthy farmer named Devraj arrived with 3 wagons of grain that clearly showed signs of mold. The grain was still edible, still nutritious, but it violated Bharat's usual standards. As Bharat prepared to reject the load, Devraj drew him aside. "Inspector Sahib," Devraj said quietly, "I know this grain is not perfect, but consider, if you reject it, my family faces ruin, and the people who will eventually eat this grain are poor villagers who have eaten worse. They will never know the difference, and it will keep them from starving." Bharat examined the grain again, conflicted. It was true that poor people often ate grain far worse than this, and it was also true that rejecting this much grain would leave the storehouse dangerously low. "I understand your situation," Bharat said finally, "but I cannot approve grain that does not meet standards." Devraj nodded sadly, then reached into his robes and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Inspector Sahib, perhaps there is a way to see this grain differently. My gratitude for your understanding would be substantial." The pouch contained more silver coins than Bharat earned in 3 months. As he held it, feeling its weight, he looked again at the grain. Perhaps he had been too harsh in his initial assessment. The mold was present, but not severe. The grain was certainly edible, and hunger was worse than slightly imperfect food. "The grain is acceptable for storage," Bharat announced, applying his seal to the inspection documents. "But it should be distributed first, before the premium grain, to ensure it is used while still fresh." That evening, Bharat sat in his house holding the silver coins, telling himself he had made a compassionate decision that served everyone's interests. The grain was not dangerous, just not perfect. The farmer was saved from ruin. The storehouse maintained its reserves, and Bharat's family would eat a little better for several months. But guilt followed him into sleep, and he woke several times during the night, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The next morning brought another farmer with questionable grain and another leather pouch. This grain was worse, definitely moldy, with a musty smell that indicated the mold was well established. Under any normal circumstances, this grain would be suitable only for animal feed. But the farmer's story was heartbreaking. His wife was sick, his youngest child had a weak chest that required expensive medicine, and rejection of this crop would mean losing his land to creditors. The leather pouch contained even more coins than the first. Bharat found himself examining the grain with softer eyes. Yes, there was mold, but people had eaten moldy grain throughout history. Properly cooked, it might cause no harm at all. And the alternative, a family losing their land, a sick woman unable to afford medicine, children forced from their home, seemed worse than any theoretical risk from slightly contaminated grain. Approved for immediate distribution, Bharat stamped the documents, his hand trembling slightly. By the end of harvest season, Bharat had accumulated more wealth than he had ever imagined possible. His standards had gradually eroded as the bribes grew larger and his rationalizations more sophisticated. He told himself he was being practical rather than corrupt, compassionate rather than greedy. The grain he approved was not good, but it was not poison either. People needed food, and food that was less than perfect was better than no food at all. The years that followed established a pattern. Word spread quietly among the wealthier farmers that Inspector Bharat could be persuaded to approve marginal grain for a reasonable consideration. Poor farmers, who had no coins to offer, found their perfectly good grain subjected to harsh scrutiny, while wealthy farmers saw inferior crops pass inspection with minimal examination. Bharat convinced himself this system was actually more fair than his previous rigid standards. Rich farmers paid extra for the privilege of selling substandard grain, while poor farmers received rigorous quality control that protected their reputations. Everyone benefited in their own way. But the quality of grain in the regional storehouse declined steadily. What had once been renowned throughout the kingdom for its excellence became known as adequate at best. Traders from other regions began offering lower prices, commenting that the grain lacked the quality they remembered from previous years. Bharat explained these changes as the result of difficult weather, poor soil conditions, and changes in farming practices. He produced detailed reports showing how environmental factors had affected crop quality throughout the region, carefully documenting everything except his own role in approving grain that should have been rejected. In the 12th year of his service, the rains failed completely. The drought was worse than anyone had experienced in living memory, and by harvest time it was clear that the crop yields would be catastrophically low. The regional administrator sent urgent messages to neighboring regions, trying to negotiate grain purchases to prevent famine. But neighboring regions had their own shortages, and the prices they quoted for emergency grain were far beyond what the regional treasury could afford. The administrator called a meeting of all village leaders to explain the situation. "We must rely on our stored reserves," the administrator announced grimly. "The grain in our storehouse will have to sustain us through the worst shortages. We will implement strict rationing, and every family will receive equal shares regardless of their ability to pay." Bharat felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The stored grain that would now feed the entire region, including his own family, was largely the inferior, moldy grain he had approved over the past 4 years. What had seemed like a reasonable compromise when it affected only the poor would now be eaten by everyone, rich and poor alike. When the distribution began, Bharat watched with growing horror as families lined up to receive their rations of grain that he knew was contaminated. The mold was not immediately visible, hidden within the good grain and disguised by careful mixing. But he could smell it in the sacks, could see it sometimes in the dust that rose when the grain was poured. "Inspector Sahib," asked Kamala, the woman who managed the distribution, "this grain smells strange. Are you certain it's safe?" Bharat's throat felt dry. "All grain develops some odor during storage," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Cook it thoroughly, and it will be fine." But as weeks passed and the grain rations continued, people began falling ill. At first it was just stomach complaints, nausea, and digestive problems that people attributed to the stress of rationing and insufficient food. But then, more serious symptoms appeared: persistent headaches, breathing difficulties, and a variety of mysterious ailments that the regional physician couldn't explain. Children and elderly people were affected most severely. Their weaker systems couldn't process the contaminated grain that stronger adults could tolerate. In the poorest families, where people had no choice but to eat every grain of their rations, the illness rates were highest. Bharat watched his own neighbors growing sick, watched children in his own village developing the telltale symptoms he was beginning to recognize as mold poisoning. And then, with a horror that felt like ice in his chest, he watched his own children begin to show the same signs. His eldest son started complaining of stomach pains and headaches. His daughter developed a persistent cough that grew worse each day. His youngest child, barely walking, became listless and stopped eating, losing weight with frightening speed. Bharat brought his children to the physician, a man he had known for years. The physician examined them carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "These symptoms are becoming common throughout the region," the physician said quietly, closing his examination bag. "I believe we are seeing the effects of contaminated grain. There appears to be mold toxin in the food supply, probably from grain that should never have been approved for human consumption." That night, Bharat sat beside his sick children's beds, watching them sleep fitfully, their breathing labored, their small faces flushed with fever. In his hands, he held the leather pouches full of silver coins he had accumulated over the years, and for the first time, he understood the true cost of what he had bought with those bribes. The next morning brought a visitor, an old monk who traveled between villages offering comfort to the sick and guidance to the troubled. Bharat's wife had invited him in, hoping he might have herbs or prayers that could help their children. The monk examined the children gently, his weathered hands soft on their fevered foreheads. Then he sat with Bharat in the main room of the house, his eyes full of compassion, but also of terrible clarity. "This sickness is spreading through the region like flood water," the monk said quietly. "It comes from poisoned grain that someone approved for human consumption when it should have been destroyed or used only for animal feed." Bharat felt as if the world was tilting around him. Surely the grain inspector would never approve dangerous grain, he said weakly. The monk studied Bharat's face for a long moment. The grain inspector is human, like all of us. Perhaps he convinced himself that grain that was not good enough for his own table was good enough for poor people's tables. Perhaps he told himself that slightly poisoned food was better than no food at all. "And now?" Bharat whispered. "Now the poison has reached every table in the region, including his own," the monk replied gently. "This is how the universe teaches us that we cannot separate ourselves from the consequences of our actions. What we do to others, we ultimately do to ourselves and those we love most." Bharat closed his eyes, feeling the weight of understanding settle on him like stones. "Is there any way to heal what has been broken?" he asked. "Truth," the monk said simply. "Truth spoken fully, without reservation or self-protection. The poison in the grain can be treated with medicine and time, but the poison in the heart requires complete honesty, no matter the cost." Bharat looked toward his children's room, where he could hear his wife singing softly to comfort their fevered sleep. The silver coins that had once seemed like security now felt like chains binding him to his shame. "If I tell the truth," he said, "I will lose everything. My position, my reputation, probably my freedom. My family will suffer." "Your family is already suffering," the monk replied gently, "and they will continue to suffer until the truth is spoken and the poison stops flowing." This story shows us how our secret compromises create visible consequences. Bharat discovered that what we do in darkness always emerges into light, often touching those we most wish to protect. Buddhism teaches that karma is not punishment, but education, the universe's way of showing us the true results of our choices. When we make decisions based on immediate benefit rather than long-term wisdom, we plant seeds that bloom into exactly the lessons we need to learn, though rarely the lessons we want to receive. Let us breathe together for a moment. Feel your breath moving gently through you, carrying away any heaviness these stories might have stirred. Notice how your body rests, supported and safe. There is nothing you need to solve or fix right now. Simply be here, breathing softly, letting these teachings settle like rain on fertile ground. We return now to Tarun at the mountain temple, facing the truth that silver cannot lie. The monk's words hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with meaning. Tarun stared at the blackened ring, seeing it clearly for the first time, not as an unfortunate accident of travel, but as a mirror reflecting the state of his heart. "The ring isn't punishing me," Tarun said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "It's showing me what I've become." "Yes," the monk said softly. "Silver is honest in ways we often are not. It cannot pretend or rationalize. It simply reveals what is true. Tarun was quiet for a long time, watching the temple fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I made promises to my wife, sacred promises, and I broke them, city by city, choice by choice, telling myself small betrayals didn't matter because they were secret. And now? The monk asked. Now I see that nothing is truly secret. Everything I did is written on this ring for anyone to see. Tarun twisted the band around his finger, feeling its weight differently now. But how can I face her? How can I return home wearing evidence of my betrayal? The monk stirred the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the temple's open ceiling. Tell me, he said, what do you think your wife will see when she looks at that ring? My shame, Tarun said immediately. My faithlessness, proof that her trust was misplaced. Perhaps, the monk said, or perhaps she will see something else entirely. What else could she possibly see? A man who wore his promises even when they became uncomfortable. A man who could have thrown the ring away and lied about losing it, but chose to carry his shame home rather than add deception to betrayal. A man who learned something important about the weight of his own choices. Tarun looked at the ring again, trying to see it through different eyes. You think I should tell her everything? I think, the monk said carefully, that truth has a way of revealing itself whether we choose to speak it or not. The ring has already told its story. The question is whether you will help her understand what it means or leave her to guess. That night, Tarun barely slept. He lay on the simple mat the monk had provided, staring up at stars visible through the temple's open roof, turning the ring around and around on his finger. By morning, he had made his decision. I will tell her everything, he said, as the monk served him tea and simple rice for breakfast. I will explain what happened, city by city, choice by choice. I will ask her forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. And if she cannot forgive you, the monk asked gently. Tarun felt tears starting in his eyes. Then I will live with the consequences of my choices. But I will not add more lies to the lies I've already told. The monk smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Now you begin to understand what the ring has been trying to teach you. Silver becomes bright again when it is cleaned with truth and polished with genuine remorse. On his final day of travel, Tarun cleaned the ring one more time, not with compounds or acids, but with honest tears and heartfelt regret. As he wept over it, remembering each betrayal and feeling genuine sorrow for the pain he had caused, something remarkable happened. The blackness began to lift, not returning the silver to its original brightness, but revealing a different kind of beauty, the patina of experience, of lessons learned through suffering. When Tarun reached his hometown, the ring was no longer black, but had become a deep, rich gray that caught light in complex ways. The engraved symbols were visible again, though softened and changed by all they had witnessed. Mira was waiting for him at their home, as he had known she would be. She ran to embrace him, her face bright with joy and relief. As she held him, her hands found his as they always had, and her fingers immediately noticed the ring's changed surface. She pulled back to look at it, her expression shifting from joy to confusion to something deeper and more complicated. The ring has changed, she said quietly. Yes, Tarun replied, meeting her eyes directly. As have I. And there are things I need to tell you, difficult things, before we can truly be together again. They sat in their garden as the sun set, and Tarun told her everything. Every city, every compromise, every betrayal. He watched her face change as he spoke, saw love and hurt and disappointment and understanding pass through her eyes like weather across a landscape. When he finished, they sat in silence for a long time, the changed ring visible between them in the fading light. "I should hate you," Mira said finally. "I should send you away and never speak to you again." "Yes," Tarun agreed. "You should. But you came home. You could have had a new ring made, could have lied, could have hidden everything. Instead, you chose to wear your mistakes where I could see them." "The ring taught me that truth has its own weight," Tarun said. "I couldn't carry lies anymore." Mira picked up his hand, examining the ring closely. In the twilight, its gray surface seemed to glow with soft inner light. "It's beautiful," she said, surprising them both. Not the beauty it had before, but a different kind of beauty. The beauty of something that has been tested and changed and learned to be honest about what it has experienced. This story shows us how the universe keeps perfect accounts of our choices. Tarun discovered that what we do in secret writes itself upon our lives in ways we cannot control or hide. The Buddha taught that our actions carry their own consequences, not as punishment, but as teaching. When we try to live double lives, we split ourselves in ways that eventually demand healing through truth. Let us explore another story about how small compromises can create great collapses and see what it teaches us about the seeds we plant in darkness. Take a gentle breath and feel your body settling deeper into rest. Notice how each exhale carries away tension, how each inhale brings you more fully into this present moment. Let your breathing soften, allowing these ancient teachings to work in you like medicine, healing old wounds and preventing new ones. There lived in a mountain village a young woman named Kira, whose gift for weaving was renowned throughout the entire region. She had learned the craft from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken line of knowledge passed down through generations of skilled hands. Kira's weavings were extraordinary, tapestries that seemed to glow with inner light, rugs that felt like walking on clouds, clothing that draped like flowing water. People traveled from distant cities to commission work from her, willing to pay prices that made her the wealthiest person in her village. The secret of Kira's skill lay not just in her inherited knowledge, but in her absolute dedication to using only the finest materials. She spun her own thread from silk produced by worms, fed on leaves from specific trees that grew only in the highest meadows. She dyed her threads with pigments made from rare flowers that bloomed for only a few weeks each year. Every aspect of her craft was governed by standards so high that other weavers considered them impractical. "Why do you make your work so difficult?" asked Naran, another weaver in the village who produced adequate work much more quickly and easily. People cannot tell the difference between thread spun from premium silk and thread spun from ordinary silk. The extra effort you put in is invisible to your customers. "But it is not invisible to me," Kira replied, her fingers never pausing in their work. "I know the difference, and that knowledge lives in every thread I weave. The quality shows itself in ways that cannot be faked or imitated." For 7 years, Kira maintained these impossibly high standards, and her reputation grew accordingly. Merchants carried her weavings to the capital city, where they were displayed in the palaces of the wealthy and powerful. The royal family itself commissioned pieces from the mountain weaver, whose work surpassed anything produced by the court's own craftsmen. But in the 8th year, everything changed. A blight affected the special trees whose leaves fed Kira's silkworms, and the worms produced silk that was thinner and weaker than usual. The rare flowers that provided her finest dyes bloomed poorly, yielding pigments that lacked their usual intensity and permanence. At the same time, demand for Kira's work reached new heights. The royal family had commissioned a massive tapestry to commemorate the kingdom's founding, offering a price so extraordinary that it would support Kira and her family for years. Other wealthy patrons, not wanting to wait for her attention, began offering bonuses for quick completion of their own commissions. Kira found herself facing an impossible choice. She could maintain her standards and disappoint customers who had paid extraordinary sums and waited months for their pieces. Or she could compromise slightly, using silk that was merely excellent instead of perfect, dyes that were very good instead of flawless, and fulfill all her commitments on schedule. Standing in her workshop, examining the inferior silk and less vibrant dyes, Kira wrestled with her conscience. The difference was small, she told herself. Only an expert would notice. The pieces would still be beautiful, still far superior to anything other weavers could produce. Just this once, she whispered to herself, beginning to set up her loom with the compromised materials, until the trees recover and the flowers bloom properly again. The royal tapestry was the first piece Kira completed using her lowered standards. When she shipped it to the capital, it was indeed beautiful, a masterwork by any reasonable measure. The royal family praised it extravagantly, hung it in the throne room, and recommended Kira's work to nobles throughout the kingdom. But Kira knew. Every time she looked at the tapestry before it was shipped, she could see the slightly irregular texture of the inferior silk, could detect the subtle fading in dyes that lacked the permanence of her usual pigments. What others saw as magnificent, she experienced as failure. No one can tell the difference, she told herself. I am being too hard on myself. But doubt had entered her workshop like water seeping through a cracked foundation, and once present, it began to spread. The next commission was easier to compromise on. After all, if the royal family couldn't detect the difference between her perfect work and her nearly perfect work, surely this merchant's wife would be even less discerning. Kira used silk that was merely good instead of excellent, saved time by using synthetic dyes instead of her carefully prepared natural ones. Each piece that left her workshop was still beautiful, still superior to the work of other weavers, but each piece also carried within it the seed of compromise, the knowledge that corners had been cut, standards lowered, traditions abandoned for the sake of convenience and profit. By the end of the year, Kira's workshop had become a place she barely recognized. Where once every tool had been kept in perfect condition, where every material had been the finest available, where every process had been followed with religious precision, now efficiency ruled over excellence. She hired assistants to handle the simpler aspects of the work, teaching them shortcuts that would have horrified her grandmother. She bought prepared threads instead of spinning her own, purchased dyes from traders instead of making them from gathered flowers. What had once been a sacred craft became a profitable business. The changes were gradual enough that customers didn't notice them immediately. Kira's reputation carried her through the transition, and people continued to pay premium prices for work that was no longer premium quality. But other weavers began to notice. Kira's recent work lacks something, observed Mira, an older weaver from a neighboring village. It is still skillful, but it feels different somehow, less alive. Perhaps she is getting older, suggested another weaver, or perhaps success has made her careless. But the truth was more complex than age or carelessness. Kira's work lacked life because she had systematically removed the elements that gave it life, the perfect materials, the careful processes, the absolute dedication to standards that seemed impossible to maintain. In the second year of her compromised practice, disaster struck in a way that revealed the true cost of her shortcuts. The royal family commissioned another major piece, a ceremonial robe for the crown prince's wedding. They specified that they wanted work identical in quality to the tapestry Kira had created the year before. Kira accepted the commission eagerly, not recognizing the trap she had set for herself. The tapestry had been made with materials that were merely excellent, but in the year since, her standards had continued to slip, and her current materials were merely adequate. To match the quality of the previous piece, she would need to return to standards she had abandoned months before. But returning to higher standards proved more difficult than abandoning them had been. The suppliers who provided her premium materials had found other customers. The processes she had streamlined could not easily be made complex again. The assistants she had trained in shortcuts resisted learning the more difficult traditional methods. Most problematically, Kira herself had lost the discipline that absolute standards require. Having convinced herself once that small compromises were acceptable, she found it nearly impossible to return to the uncompromising perfectionism that had made her reputation. The robe she delivered for the prince's wedding was beautiful by most standards, but it was visibly inferior to the tapestry that had established the royal family's expectations. The silk was rougher, the dyes less vibrant, the weaving less precise. Where the tapestry had seemed to glow with inner light, the robe merely reflected external light. The royal family's disappointment was polite, but unmistakable. They paid the agreed price, but made no new commissions. Word spread through the capital's artistic community that the mountain weaver's work was declining, that her recent pieces lacked the magic that had made her famous. Other customers began comparing their new acquisitions to pieces Kira had made years before, and the differences that had once been invisible to them became obvious through direct comparison. Complaints trickled in, then flowed, then poured. "This tapestry is fading after only 6 months," wrote one customer. "The one you made for my neighbor 3 years ago still looks as vibrant as the day it was hung. The rug you completed last month is already showing wear patterns," complained another. "My friend's rug from your workshop has been in use for years and still looks new." Kira found herself in the position of trying to explain why her recent work was inferior to her earlier work without admitting that she had deliberately lowered her standards. Each explanation felt like another compromise, another step away from the honesty that had once defined her approach to her craft. She considered returning to her original methods, but the financial reality was daunting. Premium materials cost far more than adequate ones. Traditional processes took much longer than streamlined ones. Her assistants, accustomed to easier methods, would need to be retrained or replaced. Her profit margins, which had grown comfortable during the years of compromise, would shrink dramatically. More fundamentally, Kira discovered that she had lost something essential during her years of lowered standards, the ability to see clearly. Having convinced herself for so long that small compromises didn't matter, she could no longer distinguish between work that met her original standards and work that merely approximated them. One morning, as Kira stood in her workshop surrounded by half-completed pieces that satisfied neither her old standards nor her customers' expectations, she heard a voice from the doorway. "Your grandmother would weep to see this place." Kira turned to find Sarah, an ancient woman who had been her grandmother's friend and teacher, standing in the workshop entrance. Sarah was nearly blind with age, but her fingers still remembered the feel of perfect thread, and her nose could still detect the difference between natural and synthetic dyes. "Sarah Auntie," Kira said, trying to hide her embarrassment. "I wasn't expecting you." "I came because people are talking," Sarah said, moving slowly into the workshop, her fingers trailing over tools and materials with the familiarity of a lifetime spent among such things. "They say Kira the Weaver has lost her way, that her work no longer carries the blessing of the ancestors." "People exaggerate," Kira said defensively. "My work is still beautiful." Sarah picked up a piece of the thread Kira had been using, rubbing it between her fingers with the concentration of a wine taster examining a vintage. "This thread was spun quickly," she said, "by someone who valued speed over quality. It will not hold dyes properly, will not wear well, will not weave into cloth that lasts." She moved to the dyes, opening containers and breathing in their scents. "These pigments come from bottles, not flowers. They will fade in sunlight, will bleed when wet, will never achieve the depth of color that makes people stop and stare." Finally, she examined a half-completed tapestry on Kira's loom, her ancient hands reading the weaving like a manuscript. "The pattern is correct," she said slowly. "The technique is adequate, but the soul is missing. This is the work of someone who knows how to weave, but has forgotten why to weave." Kira felt tears starting in her eyes. "I wanted to fulfill all the commissions, to satisfy all the customers. I thought small compromises wouldn't matter." "Small compromises?" Sarah repeated softly. "Do you know what your grandmother used to say about small compromises?" Kira shook her head. "She said they are like small holes in a dike. Each one seems harmless by itself, but together they let in the flood that destroys everything. Let us pause here and breathe together. Feel the air moving gently through your body, carrying away any tension or sadness these stories might have stirred. Notice how your body rests, supported and safe. There is nothing you need to fix or change right now. Simply be here, breathing softly, letting these teachings settle into your heart like seeds finding their proper depth in fertile soil." Sarah's words hung in the workshop air like the scent of dying flowers. Kira looked around at her compromised materials, her shortcuts, her half-finished pieces that carried none of the magic that had once made her name whispered with reverence throughout the kingdom. "Can it be repaired?" Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I find my way back to what I was?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her ancient hand still touching the inferior tapestry, feeling its flaws through her fingertips. "The path back is always longer than the path away," she said finally, "and it requires something that compromise destroys. The willingness to sacrifice profit for perfection, speed for quality, easy approval for difficult truth." "Show me," Kira said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Show me how to return to what I should never have left." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "First, we burn everything that carries the seed of compromise. Every thread spun in haste, every dye mixed for convenience, every tool that makes easy what should be difficult. We begin again with nothing but knowledge and commitment." The burning took 3 days. Kira watched months of work disappear into flames, saw thousands of coins worth of materials reduced to ash and smoke. Each piece that burned had represented a compromise, a small betrayal of the standards her grandmother had died protecting. "It hurts to watch it burn," Sarah observed as they stood before the fire on the final evening. "Yes," Kira agreed, tears streaming down her face. "But it hurts less than it hurt to create it." With her workshop emptied of everything tainted by compromise, Kira began the long journey back to excellence. Sarah stayed to guide her, sleeping on a mat in the corner of the workshop, waking before dawn to check that Kira was maintaining the disciplines that true craft required. The work was harder than Kira remembered. Her hands, grown soft from using inferior materials, cracked and bled as she returned to spinning thread from raw silk. Her eyes, accustomed to the easy visibility of synthetic dyes, strained to detect the subtle variations in natural pigments that determined their quality and permanence. But slowly, day by day, the old skills returned. More importantly, the old seeing returned. The ability to distinguish between thread that was merely good and thread that was perfect, between dyes that would last decades and dyes that would fade in months. The first piece Kira completed after her return to true standards was a simple scarf, nothing more complex than an exercise to test her recovered abilities. When she held it up to the morning light streaming through her workshop window, both women wept. "There," Sarah said softly. "There is the blessing returning. The ancestors smile on this work." Word of Kira's transformation spread slowly through the community of those who understood craft at its highest levels. Master artisans from other disciplines came to see if the stories were true, if the weaver had truly returned to the impossible standards that had made her legendary. They found a workshop transformed. Where efficiency had once ruled, reverence now governed every action. Where shortcuts had multiplied like weeds, traditions grew like carefully tended flowers. Where compromise had rotted the foundation, absolute commitment now provided unshakable strength. The work that emerged from this purified workshop carried a quality that even untrained eyes could recognize. Pieces that seemed to breathe with their own life, that grew more beautiful with contemplation, that somehow elevated everything around them simply by existing. But the market response was initially devastating. Customers who had grown accustomed to receiving completed work within weeks now faced waiting periods measured in months. Prices that had been high became astronomical as Kira returned to using only the finest materials and most time-consuming processes. Many customers canceled their orders, choosing weavers who could deliver acceptable work quickly rather than waiting for perfect work eventually. Kira's income, which had grown comfortable during her years of compromise, shrank to levels that barely covered her basic needs. "Are you certain this path is wise?" asked Naran, the practical weaver who had questioned Kira's standards years before. "You could find a middle way, maintaining higher quality than before while still being reasonable about time and cost." "There is no middle way in matters of truth," Sarah replied before Kira could speak. "Excellence admits no compromise. Either the work carries the blessing of the ancestors or it does not. There is no space between." Kira discovered that Sarah was right. Having experienced both the satisfaction of uncompromising excellence and the hollow feeling of profitable compromise, she could no longer accept anything between them. Her standards became more absolute than they had ever been, as if the years of compromise had burned away her tolerance for anything less than perfect. Months passed before the first new commission arrived. A simple wall, hanging requested by a master potter, whose own work embodied the same uncompromising excellence Kira had returned to. He had heard stories of the weaver's transformation and wanted to see if they were true. When Kira delivered the completed piece, the potter examined it with the careful attention of someone who understood what true mastery looked like. His examination took nearly an hour, during which he said nothing, simply looking and touching and holding the weaving up to different lights. "Yes," he said finally. "This is the work of someone who remembers what craft is for. I will tell others." And he did. Word spread through the network of master artisans, the quiet community of people who created beauty not for profit, but because beauty needed to be created. Commissions began arriving from customers who understood the difference between expensive work and priceless work, who were willing to wait years for pieces that would outlast generations. The royal family, hearing rumors that the mountain weaver had rediscovered her legendary abilities, sent a representative to commission a new piece, a tapestry for the princess's coming-of-age ceremony. But they stipulated that the work must match the quality of Kira's earliest pieces, the ones that had first brought her to royal attention. When the completed tapestry arrived at the palace, the royal family gathered to examine it in silence that stretched for long minutes. Finally, the princess herself spoke. "This is not the same weaver who made my brother's wedding robe," she said. "This is the weaver who made the ancestor tapestry that hangs in the Hall of Memory, the one visitors travel from distant lands to see. Somehow, she has become herself again." This story shows us how small compromises create great collapses, and how the seeds we plant in darkness always bloom in daylight. Kira discovered that there is no middle path between excellence and mediocrity, no safe space where we can lower our standards slightly without consequence. Buddhism teaches that integrity is indivisible. Once we accept compromise in small things, we lose the ability to maintain perfection in great things. When we sacrifice what is right for what is convenient, we plant seeds that will bloom into exactly the lessons we need to learn. Let us breathe together, feeling the air move gently through you, carrying away any heaviness from these teachings. Notice how your body rests, supported and peaceful. There is nothing to accomplish in this moment, nothing to become. Simply breathe and be here, letting these ancient wisdoms work in you like healing medicine. We return now to another story about how the universe holds perfect accounts of our choices, and see what it reveals about the invisible threads that connect our actions to our fate. There lived in a prosperous trading city a young merchant named Vikram, who had inherited his father's import business and expanded it beyond anything the family had ever imagined. Vikram dealt in luxury goods from across the known world, precious stones from mountain kingdoms, rare spices from island nations, fine textiles from desert cities, and delicate porcelain from lands so distant their names were barely whispered. Vikram's success came from his remarkable ability to judge quality and authenticity. He could hold a gemstone to the light and determine not only its value, but the specific mine it had come from. He could taste a pinch of spice and tell you the elevation at which it had been grown, the season it had been harvested, the method used to dry and preserve it. This expertise made Vikram's shop the destination for discerning customers throughout the region. Wealthy families trusted him to acquire treasures for their homes, knowing that anything bearing his personal seal would be exactly what it claimed to be. His reputation for absolute honesty was worth more than all the goods in his warehouse. But reputation, Vikram discovered, was both blessing and burden. The same discernment that made him successful also made him acutely aware of flaws that other merchants either couldn't detect or chose to ignore. While his competitors sold imperfect goods at perfect prices, Vikram rejected anything that fell short of his exacting standards. This integrity came at a cost. Suppliers who could sell flawed merchandise to other dealers found Vikram's inspections frustratingly thorough. Customers who might accept inferior goods from other merchants expected perfection from Vikram's shop. His profit margins remained smaller than those of less scrupulous competitors, and his inventory moved more slowly because of his refusal to compromise on quality. The crisis began in Vikram's 7th year of business, when a prolonged war between distant kingdoms disrupted trade routes and made genuine luxury goods almost impossible to obtain. Caravans that had once arrived monthly now appeared every few months, often carrying goods that had been damaged during the dangerous journey through contested territories. At the same time, demand for luxury goods in Vikram's city increased dramatically. A royal wedding was planned, bringing visiting dignitaries who expected to find the finest merchandise available. Wealthy families wanted to impress their guests with rare treasures, and they were willing to pay unprecedented prices for items that would demonstrate their sophistication and status. Vikram found himself caught between empty warehouses and desperate customers. The goods he could obtain fell short of his usual standards: gemstones with barely visible inclusions, spices that had been properly stored but lacked peak freshness, textiles that were beautiful but showed minor flaws under close inspection. These items are still superior to anything available elsewhere in the city, observed Raj, Vikram's assistant and cousin, as they examined a shipment of emeralds that would normally have been rejected for small internal fractures. Your customers would be delighted with quality like this from any other dealer. Vikram held one of the emeralds up to the afternoon light streaming through his shop window, studying the tiny fractures that marred its internal structure. To most eyes, the stone was perfect. A brilliant green gem that would make a magnificent centerpiece for a necklace or ring. Only someone with Vikram's trained vision could detect the flaws that compromised its long-term durability. "But they expect more from us," Vikram replied, setting the stone down with reluctance. "Our seal promises perfection, not adequacy." "And what good is perfection if we have nothing to sell?" Raj asked practically. "The royal wedding is in 2 months. If we have no inventory for the celebration, our customers will go elsewhere and may never return." That evening, Vikram sat alone in his shop, surrounded by goods that were excellent by any reasonable standard, but fell short of the perfection his reputation demanded. In the fading light, the flawed emeralds still caught fire with beautiful green light. The slightly imperfect spices still filled the air with intoxicating fragrance. The textiles with minor irregularities still felt like liquid luxury beneath his fingers. For the first time in his career, Vikram found himself considering the unthinkable, selling goods that he knew contained flaws, trusting that his customers' less trained eyes would not detect what his expertise revealed. The rationalization came easily once he allowed it to begin. The flaws were minor, invisible to anyone without professional training. The goods were still superior to anything available from competitors. The prices he charged reflected current market conditions, not the perfect quality he had always provided. His customers would be getting excellent value, even if not perfect quality. The first compromise was the smallest: a string of pearls with 2 specimens that showed barely detectable variations in surface texture. Vikram convinced himself that pearls were organic gems, naturally irregular, and that perfect uniformity was actually unnatural and suspicious. He sold the pearls to Lady Mira, wife of a prominent minister, for her appearance at the royal wedding. When she held them up to admire their luster, her face glowed with delight. "They're magnificent, Vikram," she said. "I knew I could trust you to find something truly special." Vikram felt a stab of guilt at her trust, but her obvious pleasure in the purchase eased his conscience. She was happy. The pearls were beautiful, and the minor flaws would never be noticed by anyone who saw her wearing them. The second compromise followed within days: a ceremonial dagger with a handle of carved ivory that showed hairline stress fractures invisible unless examined under magnification. The customer was a collector who prized the weapon's historical significance more than its perfect condition, and who would likely display it in a case rather than handle it regularly. With each compromise, Vikram's internal resistance weakened, while his external justifications grew more sophisticated. He developed categories for different types of flaws: aesthetic imperfections that affected appearance but not function, structural flaws that might matter eventually, but posed no immediate problems, and authenticity questions that concerned provenance rather than quality. His inventory began moving again. Customers who had been disappointed by his empty shelves were delighted to find his shop restocked with treasures that, while not quite perfect, were still far superior to anything available elsewhere. The royal wedding brought unprecedented business, with visiting dignitaries competing to acquire pieces from the merchant whose reputation guaranteed authenticity and quality. But Vikram discovered that compromise had its own momentum. Having convinced himself that minor flaws were acceptable, he found it increasingly difficult to define where minor ended and major began. Gemstones with barely visible inclusions gave way to stones with small but noticeable flaws. Textiles with minor irregularities were followed by fabrics with more obvious imperfections. Each sale required more elaborate justifications and more creative presentations. Vikram learned to position gems to hide their flaws, to fold textiles to conceal their imperfections, to describe historical artifacts in ways that emphasized their significance while downplaying their condition problems. His assistant Raj watched these changes with growing concern. "Cousin," he said one morning as Vikram prepared to sell a jade sculpture with a crack that had been cleverly concealed with green wax, "are you certain this is wise? Your reputation is built on absolute honesty about quality." "I'm not lying about anything," Vikram replied defensively. "This jade is authentic, ancient, and beautiful. The crack doesn't affect its historical value or aesthetic appeal." "But you're not mentioning the crack either," Raj observed gently. "Why would I emphasize a minor flaw that doesn't affect the piece's essential qualities?" Vikram asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "Would you have me talk customers out of purchases by focusing on irrelevant details?" But even as he spoke the words, Vikram knew they weren't entirely true. The flaws weren't irrelevant. They affected value, durability, and long-term satisfaction. His previous practice of full disclosure had built trust precisely because customers knew he would tell them everything they needed to know, even information that might reduce their enthusiasm for a purchase. The transformation accelerated over the following months. What had begun as occasional compromises became standard practice. Vikram's shop filled with goods that looked magnificent but carried hidden flaws, gems with concealed fractures, artifacts with disguised damage, textiles with clever repairs that hid original tears. His profit margins increased dramatically as he learned to present flawed goods as perfect ones. Customers paid premium prices for items that had cost him far less than the perfect specimens he had once insisted upon. Business had never been better, at least from a financial perspective. But success brought its own problems. Other merchants in the city began to wonder how Vikram maintained his inventory when genuine perfect goods had become almost impossible to obtain. Competitors who had once respected his standards started questioning whether his recent acquisitions could possibly be as flawless as he claimed. "I examined a piece Vikram sold last month," mentioned Devi, an established jewelry merchant, during a gathering of the city's trading guild. "The customer brought it to me for setting, and I noticed inclusions in the central stone that Vikram should certainly have detected. Perhaps his standards are evolving with market conditions," suggested another merchant diplomatically. "Perfect goods are impossible to find these days." "Or perhaps his reputation is protecting him from the scrutiny his goods deserve," Devi replied pointedly. Word of these conversations reached Vikram through the informal network that connected all merchants in the city. He told himself that jealous competitors were trying to damage his reputation because his business continued to thrive while theirs struggled. But doubt had entered his mind like water seeping through stone, and once present, it began to erode his confidence in his own justifications. The crisis came without warning, in the form of a customer returning a piece that had been sold months earlier, a supposedly perfect sapphire that had shattered when set into a ring. The internal fractures Vikram had concealed with careful presentation had finally propagated through the stone, destroying what should have been an heirloom piece. The customer was Lady Priya, daughter of the kingdom's chief justice, and she was accompanied by her father when she returned to Vikram's shop. They brought not only the shattered sapphire, but also a detailed report from the royal gem setter who had examined the pieces. This stone contained structural fractures that made it unsuitable for jewelry use, the justice read from the report. The fractures were not immediately visible, but should have been detected by any competent gem dealer through proper examination techniques. Vikram felt his world tilting as he looked at the shattered sapphire. He remembered the stone clearly, remembered detecting its flaws, remembered deciding they were acceptable, remembered the premium price Lady Priya had paid for what she believed was a perfect gem. This must be a mistake, Vikram stammered. I would never knowingly sell a flawed stone as perfect. Are you suggesting my daughter damaged this stone through carelessness? The justice asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. Or that the royal gem setter, whose expertise is recognized throughout the kingdom, has made an error in his evaluation? No, of course not, Vikram said quickly. Perhaps the stone was damaged during transport or... But even as he spoke, Vikram knew his explanations sounded hollow. The fractures were clearly original to the stone, patterns that formed during the gem's creation deep in the earth. No external force could have created the specific type of failure the sapphire had experienced. I will, of course, refund the full purchase price, Vikram offered, trying to salvage something from the disaster. The price is the smallest concern, the justice replied coldly. My daughter's engagement ring was destroyed 3 days before her wedding ceremony. The stone was chosen specifically because she trusted your reputation for absolute quality. The embarrassment and disappointment cannot be repaired with money. After they left, Vikram sat alone in his shop, holding the fragments of the shattered sapphire, seeing in them the reflection of his own compromised integrity. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly examine his recent sales, applying the rigorous standards he had once used without question. The results were devastating. Nearly every item he had sold in the past year contained flaws that he had concealed or ignored. Customers who had trusted his reputation had unknowingly purchased goods that fell far short of the perfection his seal had always promised. That night, Vikram barely slept. He walked through his shop in the dark, touching goods he knew were flawed, remembering the promises of quality he had made to customers who trusted him completely. By dawn, he had made a decision that would cost him everything he had built. He would contact every customer who had purchased compromised goods and offer full disclosure and refunds. The process took weeks and consumed most of his accumulated wealth. Customer after customer returned to his shop, some angry, some disappointed, some simply sad to learn that their treasured purchases were not what they had believed them to be. I thought I knew you, said Master Chen, an elderly scholar who had been buying rare books and manuscripts from Vikram for years. I trusted your judgment more than my own. To learn that you have been selling me damaged goods while claiming they were perfect, it feels like betrayal by a friend. Each conversation was more difficult than the last, but with each honest disclosure, Vikram felt something returning to him that he hadn't realized he had lost: the ability to sleep peacefully, to meet his own eyes in mirrors, to speak without calculating what truths he could safely reveal. When the last customer had been contacted and the final refund paid, Vikram's shop stood nearly empty, his reputation in ruins, his savings exhausted. But for the first time in months, he felt like himself again, flawed perhaps, certainly humbled, but no longer living a lie that grew larger with each passing day. Raj found him there one morning, sitting among the empty display cases, holding the fragment of the shattered sapphire. "What will you do now, cousin?" Raj asked gently. Vikram looked up, meeting his assistant's eyes directly for the first time in months. "I will start again," he said quietly, "with nothing but honesty and whatever wisdom I've gained from learning what happens when honesty is abandoned. This story shows us how the universe holds perfect accounts, measuring not just what we do, but what we claim about what we do." Vikram discovered that reputation built on truth cannot survive even small deceptions, that the threads connecting our actions to our fate are stronger than any rationalization we create. The Buddha taught that integrity is like a crystal. Once cracked, it cannot fully return to its original strength, but it can become beautiful in new ways if we choose transparency over concealment. Let us rest here for a moment, breathing gently together. Feel your breath moving through you like a soft wind, carrying away any tension these stories might have stirred. Notice how your body settles into this moment, supported and at peace. There is nothing to solve or fix right now. Simply breathe and be here, letting these teachings work in you like seeds, finding their proper depth in fertile ground. We will explore one more story about how small seeds planted in darkness bloom in daylight, and discover what it teaches us about the choices that seem hidden but never are. There once lived in a riverside town a woman named Anjali, who served as the keeper of public records for 7 villages along the great river that connected the mountain kingdoms to the sea. Her position required absolute trustworthiness, for she maintained the documents that determined property ownership, trade agreements, tax obligations, and legal disputes that might arise between families or communities. Anjali had been chosen for this role not only because of her skill with reading and writing, but because of her reputation for complete impartiality. She treated rich and poor alike, powerful merchants and struggling farmers, influential families and newcomers to the region with identical fairness. Her records were meticulously accurate, her decisions based purely on evidence and law, her word trusted absolutely by everyone who dealt with her. The record hall where Anjali worked was a substantial stone building with thick walls that protected the precious documents from fire, flood, and theft. Inside, thousands of scrolls and bound volumes contained the written memory of the region, deeds to land that had been passed down through generations, contracts that governed trade relationships, court decisions that established legal precedents, census records that tracked families through decades of change. Anjali knew these records better than anyone had ever known them. She could find any document within minutes, could recall the details of cases that had been decided years before her birth, could trace property ownership through complex chains of inheritance that confused even the families involved. Her knowledge made her indispensable, and her integrity made her trusted without question. For 9 years, Anjali maintained these standards without wavering. She refused gifts from grateful clients, declined invitations that might suggest favoritism, and made decisions based solely on what the records and the law required. Her personal life was simple and modest. She lived alone in a small house near the record hall, spent her evenings reading and copying documents, and found satisfaction in the precision and clarity that careful record-keeping brought to her community's affairs. But in the 10th year, everything changed when Anjali's sister Kamala arrived from a distant city. bringing her 2 young children and a story of tragedy that broke Anjali's heart. Kamala's husband had been a merchant who borrowed heavily to finance a trading expedition that had been destroyed by bandits in the mountain passes. The creditors had seized everything: their house, their shop, their savings, even personal possessions that had been in Kamala's family for generations. She had fled the city with her children and the clothes they wore, seeking shelter with her sister while she tried to rebuild some kind of life from nothing. "I have no money, no skills that earn wages in a place like this," Kamala wept as she told her story. "The children need food, shelter, education. I don't know how to care for them with nothing." Anjali looked at her sister's children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, both thin from the hunger of their journey, both watching the adults with the wide, fearful eyes of children who have learned that safety cannot be assumed. The sight of them stirred something deep in Anjali's heart, a protective instinct she had never experienced before. "You will stay with me," Anjali said firmly. "All of you, for as long as needed. We will find a way forward." But providing for 3 additional people strained Anjali's modest salary beyond its limits. Food that had been adequate for 1 person left 4 people hungry. The small house that had been comfortable for someone who lived alone felt crowded and chaotic with children who needed space to play and study. Clothes, medicine, school supplies, expenses that Anjali had never considered multiplied faster than her income could grow. Within weeks, Anjali found herself worrying constantly about money. She lay awake at night calculating expenses, trying to find ways to stretch her earnings further. She began walking to work instead of hiring transport, eating simple rice instead of varied meals, wearing the same clothes until they were shabby rather than replacing them when they showed wear. The children noticed her sacrifices and felt the weight of being unwanted burdens. The boy, Arjun, offered to work instead of attending school. The girl, Lila, ate as little as possible and never asked for anything she wanted. Their attempts to minimize their impact on Anjali's life broke her heart more than their earlier tears had. It was during this period of financial stress that opportunity presented itself in the form of Govind, a wealthy landowner whose holdings bordered 3 of the villages under Anjali's jurisdiction. Govind was involved in a complex property dispute with his neighbors over water rights to a seasonal stream that had changed course during recent floods. The case was legally ambiguous. The stream had flowed along the original boundary for generations, but floods had carved a new channel that left the water entirely within Govind's property. His neighbors claimed historical rights to the water regardless of the stream's current location, while Govind argued that natural changes to waterways established new boundaries according to traditional law. Anjali spent days researching precedents, examining old maps, and consulting legal texts to determine how such disputes had been resolved in the past. The law was genuinely unclear, with reasonable arguments supporting both sides and previous court decisions that could be interpreted multiple ways. As she wrestled with the complexity of the case, Govind requested a private meeting to discuss the situation. He arrived at the record hall one evening after other visitors had departed, dressed in fine clothes that subtly displayed his wealth without seeming ostentatious. "Keeper Anjali," he said respectfully, "I understand this case presents unusual difficulties. I wanted to assure you that whatever decision you reach will be accepted gracefully by all parties involved." Anjali appreciated his reasonable tone, so different from the angry demands and veiled threats that sometimes accompany difficult cases. "The law is complex in situations like this," she replied carefully. "I am still researching precedents and consulting with legal scholars in neighboring regions." Govind nodded understandingly. Of course. Such thorough research requires time and effort beyond your normal duties. I hope you will allow me to show my appreciation for your careful attention to this matter. He placed a small leather bag on Anjali's desk, heavy with the weight of silver coins. This is not payment for any particular decision, he said quickly, seeing her expression. Merely recognition of the extra work involved in researching such a complex case. Whatever you decide based on the law and evidence, this gift acknowledges the burden I have placed on your time. Anjali stared at the bag without touching it, feeling the weight of its implications. She had never accepted payment beyond her official salary, never allowed personal considerations to influence her decisions, but she also thought of Arjun offering to abandon school to earn money, of Lila eating smaller and smaller portions to reduce expenses, of her sister's worry lines deepening each day as their situation grew more desperate. I cannot accept payment that might influence my judgment, she said finally. But this would not influence your judgment, Govind replied reasonably. You will research the case thoroughly and decide according to law, exactly as you always do. This gift merely acknowledges that my case has required extraordinary effort on your part. That night, Anjali sat in her small house listening to her sister comfort hungry children who were trying not to complain about their simple dinner of rice and lentils. The leather bag sat on the table before her, unopened but heavy with possibility. Enough silver to buy proper food for weeks, warm clothes for the coming winter, perhaps even a few small luxuries that would help the children feel less like burdens. She told herself that accepting the gift would not change her decision about the water rights case. She would still research thoroughly, still apply the law fairly, still make her judgment based on evidence and precedent. The silver was acknowledgement of extra work, nothing more. But even as she formed these rationalizations, Anjali knew she was crossing a line she had never approached before. Once she accepted payment from someone involved in a case, the relationship changed. Gratitude created obligation, even when both parties denied it. The appearance of fairness was as important as actual fairness, and accepting gifts destroyed both. The next morning, Anjali returned the unopened bag to Govind, explaining that her position required absolute impartiality, not just in fact, but in appearance. Govind accepted her refusal graciously, but his next words stayed with her throughout the day. I understand completely, Keeper Anjali. Of course, I hope you will remember that your decision affects not only legal principles, but the livelihoods of many families who depend on my land for work. Sometimes the greater good requires flexibility in applying rigid rules. As Anjali continued her research into the water rights case, she found herself thinking often about Govind's words. It was true that his land provided employment for dozens of families in the region. It was also true that his neighbors, while having historical claims to the water, were subsistence farmers whose need was great, but whose economic impact was limited. The legal precedents remained ambiguous, but Anjali noticed herself paying more attention to arguments that supported Govind's position and less attention to evidence that favored his neighbors. She told herself this was simply thorough analysis, examining all angles, considering practical consequences, as well as abstract legal principles. When she finally rendered her decision, awarding the water rights to Govind, based on the principle that natural changes to waterways established new boundaries, she felt confident that she had applied the law fairly. The decision was legally defensible, practically sensible, and served the greater economic good of the region. Govind's gratitude was expressed through a substantial donation to the record hall for improved document preservation, a gift that benefited the entire community rather than Anjali personally, and therefore seemed completely appropriate. But the neighbors who lost their water rights were devastated. 3 families had depended on that stream for irrigation that made their small farms viable. Without the water, they would be forced to sell their land and seek work elsewhere, breaking connections to ancestral homes that stretched back generations. "Keep her, Anjali," pleaded Devi, an elderly farmer whose family had worked the same land for centuries. Surely there must be some provision in the law for protecting traditional water rights. Our families have used this stream since before any written records existed. Anjali felt a stab of guilt as she looked into Devi's worried eyes, but she maintained her professional composure. "I understand your disappointment," she said gently, "but the law is clear about natural changes to waterways. When floods alter a stream's course, new boundaries are established. My decision is based on established legal precedent." After Devi left, Anjali sat alone in the record hall, surrounded by the documents that contained centuries of legal decisions, trying to convince herself that she had applied those precedents correctly. But doubt gnawed at her like a slow poison, whispering that other interpretations had been possible, that she had chosen the path that served wealth rather than justice. Over the following months, the pattern established itself more firmly. Complex cases began to resolve themselves in ways that benefited wealthy petitioners over poor ones, powerful merchants over struggling farmers, established families over newcomers to the region. Each decision was legally defensible, practically reasonable, and subtly influenced by considerations that Anjali never acknowledged even to herself. The gifts that followed successful cases were never direct payments to Anjali personally. Instead, they took the form of donations to worthy causes, improvements to the record hall, contributions to the local school, funds for road maintenance that benefited the entire community. The recipients were grateful. Anjali's reputation for civic service grew, and everyone praised her dedication to the public good. But late at night, when Anjali lay awake listening to her sister's children sleeping peacefully in their warm beds, fed by food purchased with money that had somehow become more abundant than her salary alone could explain, she felt the weight of compromises that grew heavier with each passing month. The crisis came in her second year of this corrupted practice, when a case arrived that forced her to confront the full consequences of the path she had chosen. 2 families claimed ownership of the same plot of valuable farmland near the river. The Sharmas, who had worked the land for 3 generations, but possessed only traditional verbal agreements as proof of ownership, and the Kumars, recent arrivals to the region who had purchased a written deed from a distant relative of the land's original owner. The legal question was complex. Did written documents supersede traditional use rights when the document's authenticity was questionable, and the traditional use was well established but undocumented? Different legal traditions offered different answers, and Anjali's decision would determine which family could continue farming the land that supported their livelihood. The Sharmas were simple people, hard-working farmers whose knowledge of the land was deep, but whose understanding of legal documentation was limited. They had tended this soil for decades, improving it year by year, building terraces and irrigation systems, planting orchards that were just beginning to mature. Their entire identity was bound up with this particular plot of earth. The Kumars were urban merchants who had acquired the written deed as an investment, hoping to use the land's river access for commercial purposes. They had money to hire advocates, resources to pursue legal challenges, and connections to officials who might influence the case's outcome. Under normal circumstances, Anjali would have spent weeks researching precedents, consulting with legal scholars, and examining every piece of evidence to determine which claim had stronger foundation in law and tradition. She would have visited the land personally, interviewed neighbors who might remember its history, and traced the chain of ownership back through multiple generations. But Mr. Kumar made her research unnecessary by visiting the record hall with a proposal that eliminated all uncertainty. "Keep her, Anjali," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I understand this case presents certain complexities. Perhaps we can find a way to resolve it that serves everyone's interests." He placed a thick envelope on her desk, not the small leather bag of modest bribery, but something substantial enough to solve financial problems permanently. "The Sharmas are good people," Kumar continued, "but they lack the resources to develop this land to its full potential. My plans would create employment opportunities, increase tax revenues for the region, and transform unused riverside access into profitable commerce. Everyone benefits when economic development is encouraged." Anjali looked at the envelope without touching it, feeling the familiar weight of temptation, but recognizing something different this time: the magnitude of what was being offered and what was being asked in return. "The Sharmas have farming rights that extend back generations," she said carefully. "Traditional claims that lack proper documentation," Kumar replied dismissively. "In a modern economy, we cannot allow sentimental attachment to undocumented land use to prevent legitimate development. Your decision will determine whether this region moves forward into prosperity or remains trapped in outdated agricultural practices." That night, Anjali walked to the disputed land and stood among the terraced fields the Sharmas had built over decades of patient labor. The irrigation channels they had carved carried water to fruit trees they had planted as young people and tended as they grew old. The soil that had been rocky and difficult when they began working it now supported abundant crops that fed not only their family, but several others in the region. Standing in the moonlight among these accumulated layers of human care and natural growth, Anjali felt the full weight of the decision before her. The law was genuinely ambiguous, but the human consequences were absolutely clear. The Sharmas would lose everything, not just land, but identity, purpose, the work of their lifetimes. The Kumars would gain a profitable investment that would transform familiar farmland into commercial development that served distant markets rather than local needs. The envelope sat unopened on her desk for 3 days, while Anjali wrestled with considerations that had nothing to do with law or justice. Her sister's children were thriving now, well-fed, properly clothed, attending good schools, secure in ways they had never been before. The modest prosperity that had grown around her compromised decisions had created stability, not just for her family, but for others who benefited from the improvements her civic donations had funded. Could she justify destroying this security for the sake of abstract principles? Was it fair to make her sister's children suffer for the sake of maintaining ideals that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where money determined outcomes more decisively than justice? On the 4th morning, Anjali opened the envelope and found enough wealth to secure her family's future permanently. Enough to buy a larger house, to ensure the children received the finest education available, to support her sister in starting a business that could provide independence rather than charity. But she also found something else in the envelope, a letter detailing Kumar's development plans for the disputed land. The commercial opportunities he had mentioned would involve draining the wetlands that controlled seasonal flooding, cutting the mature fruit trees that would interfere with construction, and redirecting the stream that had irrigated not only the Sharma's fields, but several neighboring farms as well. The development would benefit Kumar and his investors handsomely, but it would destroy an agricultural system that had fed the region sustainably for generations and replace it with commercial activity that served distant markets rather than local needs. Sitting in the record hall that had been her second home for over a decade, surrounded by documents that recorded centuries of legal decisions, Anjali realized she had reached the moment where choice becomes destiny. She could accept the envelope and render the decision that would secure her family's future while destroying another family's life. Or she could return the money and risk everything she had built on the foundation of previous compromises. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. She walked to Kumar's residence and returned the envelope unopened. "I cannot accept this," she said simply. "The case must be decided according to law and evidence, without regard for anyone's financial interests." Kumar's reaction was immediate and threatening. "You disappoint me, Keeper Anjali. I had hoped we could resolve this matter privately. Now I fear it will become complicated." "The law is often complicated," Anjali replied, though her hands trembled slightly. "That is why we have courts and legal procedures." "Indeed," Kumar said coldly, "and procedures can be challenged when questions arise about a record keeper's impartiality. It would be unfortunate if certain donations and decisions from recent years were subjected to official scrutiny." The threat was clear. Kumar had documented the pattern of gifts and favorable decisions that had characterized Anjali's recent years. If she ruled against him, he would expose her corruption to the authorities, destroying not only her career, but potentially resulting in criminal charges. Anjali felt the trap closing around her like water rising in a well. The compromises she had convinced herself were harmless had created a web of obligation and vulnerability that now controlled her completely. Every decision she had bent toward wealth rather than justice had become a chain binding her to continued corruption. But as she walked home through streets where she had lived and worked for over a decade, Anjali realized that the trap had another dimension she had not considered. The people of this region trusted her absolutely. Farmers and merchants, rich and poor, established families and newcomers, all believed that her decisions were based solely on law and evidence. That trust was the foundation of the entire legal system that governed their lives. If Kumar exposed her corruption, the trust would be destroyed, not only for her, but for whoever replaced her. Every decision she had made over the past decade would be questioned. Every case she had resolved would be reopened. Every precedent she had established would be suspect. The legal chaos that would follow would harm the innocent far more than the guilty. That night, as Anjali sat with her sister and the children around their dinner table in the comfortable house that compromise had provided, she looked at faces made secure by decisions that had bent justice toward personal benefit. The children laughed over their homework, confident in their futures. Her sister smiled with the relief of someone who no longer feared poverty. The warmth and safety they all enjoyed had been purchased with the integrity that had once been Anjali's most precious possession. But now, she understood the full cost of that purchase. She had not just compromised her own principles, she had undermined the system of trust that allowed law to function at all in her community. Every person who had believed they were receiving impartial justice had been deceived. Every poor family that had lost cases to wealthy opponents had been betrayed. Every young person who looked to legal institutions for protection had been taught that money mattered more than truth. The weight of this realization settled on her like stones, and for the first time in years, Anjali knew exactly what she needed to do. This story shows us how the seeds we plant in darkness always bloom in daylight, and how the threads connecting our actions to our fate grow stronger with every choice we make. Anjali discovered that compromise is not a stable place to rest, but a slope that steepens with each step we take away from truth. Buddhism teaches that integrity cannot be partially abandoned. Once we accept corruption in small matters, we lose the strength to resist it in great matters. When we choose immediate benefit over lasting principle, we plant seeds that will bloom into exactly the lessons we need to learn. Let us breathe together now, feeling the air move gently through you like a soft breeze carrying away any heaviness these teachings might have stirred. Notice how your body rests, supported and peaceful. There is nothing to accomplish in this moment, nothing to become. Simply breathe and be here, letting these ancient wisdoms settle into your heart like rain nourishing fertile soil. We have traveled far together tonight, exploring the invisible threads that connect our choices to our fate. We met Tarun, who learned that silver cannot lie and that promises made sacred become visible to the world, whether we wish it or not. We discovered through Bharat's story how what we do to others eventually touches those we love most, and how the universe teaches us that we cannot separate ourselves from the consequences of our actions. We saw with Kira how small compromises create great collapses, and how excellence admits no middle ground between truth and convenience. Through Vikram's journey, we learned how reputation built on truth cannot survive even small deceptions, and how the crystal of integrity, once cracked, shows every flaw to the light. And now, with Anjali, we see how corruption spreads like water through stone, weakening foundations we never realized were supporting everything we care about. All of these teachings point to the same profound truth, that nothing we do is truly hidden, that every choice plants seeds that will bloom in their proper season, that the universe holds accounts more perfect than any earthly bookkeeper could maintain. What we think we do in secret writes itself upon our hearts, shapes our faces, changes our voices, and eventually reveals itself to the world in ways we never expect. In your own life, you may find echoes of these stories. Perhaps there are small compromises you have made, telling yourself they don't matter because no one will know. Perhaps there are seeds planted in darkness that you hope will never see light. Perhaps there are promises made in love that have grown heavy with the weight of distance or temptation. The deepest truth these stories reveal is not that we are doomed by our mistakes, but that we are always free to choose truth over convenience, integrity over advantage, difficult honesty over easy deception. The ring can be cleaned with genuine tears. The poisoned grain can be replaced with wholesome food. The workshop can be purified by burning what carries compromise. The reputation can be rebuilt on a foundation of authentic honesty. The corruption can be confessed, and the trust slowly earned back through actions that prove words true. The path back to integrity is always longer than the path away from it, and it requires something that compromise destroys: the willingness to sacrifice profit for principle, comfort for truth, easy approval for difficult honesty. But the journey back is also a journey home, to the person we were before we learned to rationalize, before we discovered how to bend truth to serve convenience, before we forgot that what we do in secret writes itself upon the world in ways we cannot control or hide. The silver cannot lie. The grain will reveal its quality. The workshop will show its standards. The reputation will reflect its foundation, and the heart will write its truth upon everything it touches. Let your shoulders soften now as you rest in this understanding. Allow your breathing to slow, feeling each exhale carry away any tension from these stories. Notice how your body settles deeper into peace, supported by the knowledge that truth, though sometimes difficult, is always the path that leads home to ourselves. Let us explore one final story about the threads that connect our actions to our fate, and discover what it teaches us about the seeds that seem small when planted, but grow into forests that shape entire landscapes of our lives. There once lived in a scholarly city a man named Dev, whose position as chief examiner for the kingdom's civil service made him one of the most influential people in the realm. Every year, hundreds of young scholars traveled from across the land to take the examinations that would determine their eligibility for government positions: judges, administrators, tax collectors, provincial governors, and other roles that shaped the daily lives of thousands of citizens. Dev had earned his position through his own brilliant performance on these same examinations 20 years earlier, followed by distinguished service in various administrative posts. He was known for his keen intelligence, his comprehensive knowledge of law and literature, and most importantly, his absolute fairness in evaluating candidates regardless of their family background, regional origin, or personal connections. The examination system was designed to identify the most capable individuals for public service, ensuring that government positions went to those best qualified to serve the kingdom's interests, rather than to those whose only qualification was wealth or family influence. Dev took this responsibility seriously, understanding that his evaluations would determine not only individual careers, but the quality of governance that millions of people would experience. The process was elaborate and carefully structured. Candidates first submitted written examinations covering law, literature, mathematics, and practical administration. Those who passed this initial screening were invited for oral examinations, where Dev and his fellow examiners tested their ability to think quickly, speak persuasively, and demonstrate the judgment required for responsible leadership. Dev's reputation for incorruptibility was legendary. Wealthy families had tried to influence his decisions through gifts, promises, and subtle pressures, but he had never wavered in his commitment to merit-based selection. Poor scholars knew that their humble origins would not disadvantage them in Dev's examinations, while privileged candidates understood that their family connections would provide no protection from his rigorous standards. For 15 years, Dev maintained these principles without compromise, and the quality of the kingdom's administration reflected his integrity. The governors and judges selected through his examinations governed wisely and fairly. The tax collectors were honest and reasonable. The administrators were competent and dedicated to public service. The kingdom prospered under leadership chosen for ability rather than influence. But in the 16th year, everything changed when Dev's beloved son Rohan reached the age to take the civil service examinations himself. Rohan was an intelligent young man, well-educated and idealistic, but he had grown up in comfortable circumstances that had not prepared him for the fierce competition of the examinations. While other candidates had spent years in intensive study, often sacrificing comfort and social life to master the complex material, Rohan had enjoyed a balanced life of study, leisure, and social activities appropriate to his father's position. Dev watched his son prepare for the examinations with growing concern. Rohan's knowledge was adequate, but not exceptional. His thinking clear, but not brilliant. His dedication sincere, but not obsessive. In a normal year, he might have earned a respectable position in provincial administration, but this year's candidate pool was extraordinarily strong, filled with scholars whose preparation had been more rigorous and whose natural abilities seemed sharper. "Father," Rohan said one evening as the examination date approached, "I know you cannot show me favoritism, and I would never ask you to. But I wonder, might you give me some guidance about what areas of study the examiners typically emphasize?" Dev felt his heart tighten at the request. The information Rohan sought was not exactly secret. Previous examinations were matters of public record, and patterns in questioning could be analyzed by anyone willing to do the research. But Dev's intimate knowledge of this year's planned examination topics would give his son an enormous advantage over other candidates who had to guess which subjects would receive the most attention. The examinations test comprehensive knowledge, Dev replied carefully. A well-prepared candidate should be ready for questions in any area covered by the official curriculum. But privately, Dev found himself thinking about the specific topics that would dominate this year's examinations. A recent change in taxation policy meant that questions about revenue collection would be particularly important. New trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms would likely generate questions about commercial law and diplomatic protocol. Rohan was strong in these areas if he focused his remaining study time appropriately. Over the following weeks, Dev watched his son struggle with the breadth of material he needed to master in the time remaining. Rohan studied diligently, but seemed overwhelmed by the scope of knowledge expected from candidates. His confidence wavered as he compared his preparation to stories of other candidates who had been studying intensively for years. "I'm afraid I'm not ready," Rohan confessed to his father one night, his textbooks spread around him like accusatory witnesses to his inadequate preparation. Some of the other candidates have memorized entire legal codes. Others can quote classical literature from memory. I feel like I'm trying to catch rain in a teacup. Dev felt his son's anxiety as if it were his own physical pain. Here was the child he had raised and loved, the young man whose character and potential he knew intimately, facing the possibility of failure that would not only disappoint his personal ambitions, but reflect poorly on his father's reputation. How would it look if the chief examiner's own son could not pass the tests that others viewed as the ultimate measure of scholarly achievement? That night, Dev sat in his study surrounded by the examination materials he was preparing for the upcoming tests. The questions were already written, the scoring criteria established, the evaluation procedures finalized. He knew exactly which topics would be emphasized, which classical texts would be referenced, which legal cases would be discussed, which mathematical problems would be presented. The information that could save his son's career lay before him like scattered seeds that could grow into a forest of opportunity, if only he could find a way to share it without compromising his integrity. The rationalization began subtly, almost beneath the level of conscious thought. Dev told himself he was not considering cheating, merely wondering whether there might be some way to help his son prepare more effectively without actually providing unfair advantage. Perhaps he could suggest general areas of study that any wise father might recommend. Perhaps he could share insights about examination strategy that came from his experience as both test taker and test giver. But even as he formed these thoughts, Dev recognized them as the first steps down a path he had never imagined walking. The same mind that had maintained absolute integrity for 15 years now turned its intelligence toward finding ways to bend the rules without obviously breaking them. The night before the written examinations began, Dev found himself alone in his study with a choice that would define not only his son's future, but his own understanding of who he was. On his desk lay the examination questions that would be distributed the next morning, each one representing hours of careful preparation by committees of scholars, each one designed to test specific abilities that government service required. He could memorize 3 or 4 of the most difficult questions and share them with Rohan during their brief conversation at breakfast. The advantage would be enormous, but not obvious. Rohan would still need to know the correct answers, would still need to demonstrate real knowledge and understanding. It would be help, not cheating. Guidance, not corruption. Dev picked up one of the examination papers, reading through questions he had helped design, seeing them now not as instruments of fair evaluation, but as obstacles to his son's success. Question 17 tested knowledge of trade law, an area where Rohan was weak, but could strengthen quickly with focused study. Question 23 required analysis of a complex legal case, something Rohan could master if he knew which case to review in advance. For the first time in his career, Dev saw the examinations through the eyes of a parent rather than an administrator, and the perspective transformed everything. What had once seemed like reasonable tests of competency now appeared as arbitrary barriers that could destroy his son's future, based on the accident of which particular questions had been selected from an infinite universe of possible questions. As dawn approached, Dev made his decision. At breakfast, while sharing what appeared to be casual conversation about the day ahead, he mentioned 3 specific legal cases that had been much discussed lately in administrative circles. He suggested that any well-prepared candidate should be familiar with recent changes in taxation policy. He observed that classical literature often provides insight into contemporary problems of governance. Rohan listened carefully, nodding at his father's advice, apparently unaware that he had just received information that would give him a decisive advantage over other candidates. Dev felt simultaneously relieved at helping his son and sick at violating principles he had maintained for decades. The written examinations proceeded normally from Dev's perspective as chief examiner. He monitored the testing halls, ensured that proper procedures were followed, and watched hundreds of candidates struggle with questions designed to separate the capable from the exceptional. But when he observed his son working confidently through problems that were puzzling other candidates, Dev felt a mixture of pride and shame that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't untangle. Rohan performed brilliantly on the written examinations, scoring in the top 10% of all candidates. His answers to the questions Dev had guided him toward were particularly strong, showing depth of preparation that impressed even the most demanding examiners. Other candidates who had seemed more naturally gifted struggled with the specific topics that Rohan had been advised to study. "Congratulations," Dev told his son that evening, embracing him with genuine pride that was shadowed by the knowledge of how that success had been achieved. "You clearly prepared very well." "Your advice was invaluable, Father," Rohan replied, his face bright with the relief of someone who had feared failure but discovered success instead. "I focused my study exactly where you suggested, and it made all the difference." The oral examinations presented a new challenge and a new opportunity for corruption. Dev served as one of 3 examiners who questioned candidates individually, testing their ability to think quickly, articulate clearly, and demonstrate the judgment required for leadership positions. The questions were not predetermined. Examiners had discretion to explore whatever topics seemed most relevant to each candidate's background and apparent strengths. When Rohan appeared for his oral examination, Dev faced the most difficult moment of his professional career. He sat across the table from his son in the formal examination room, flanked by 2 colleague examiners who trusted his judgment completely, preparing to conduct an evaluation that would determine not only Rohan's career, but his own integrity as an administrator. The other examiners deferred to Dev's seniority, allowing him to ask the opening questions and set the tone for the evaluation. Dev looked into his son's nervous but hopeful eyes and felt the weight of 15 years of uncompromising fairness pressing against the instinct to protect and help his child. He began with standard questions, the same ones he asked every candidate, watching Rohan's answers with the careful attention he gave to all examinations. His son performed well but not exceptionally, competent but not brilliant, knowledgeable but not inspired. As the examination continued and Dev's colleagues took their turns asking questions, he found himself subtly guiding the conversation toward areas where he knew Rohan was strongest. When one examiner asked about commercial law, Dev followed up with questions specifically about trade agreements, territory Rohan had mastered thanks to his father's earlier guidance. When another examiner probed Rohan's knowledge of classical literature, Dev steered the discussion toward texts he knew his son had studied most thoroughly. The guidance was skillful and subtle. To outside observers, it appeared that Dev was simply conducting a thorough examination, exploring his son's knowledge across multiple domains. But the effect was to showcase Rohan's strengths while avoiding his weaknesses, creating a performance that seemed more impressive than it actually was. At the end of the examination, Dev's colleagues were impressed with Rohan's apparent competence and breadth of knowledge. "Your son has clearly inherited your intellectual gifts," one examiner commented to Dev privately after Rohan had departed. His answers showed remarkable depth and practical understanding. "He has worked very hard," Dev replied, feeling the words stick in his throat like pieces of broken glass. When the final results were announced, Rohan had earned appointment to a prestigious position as assistant provincial governor, a role that typically went only to candidates with truly exceptional examination performances. He would be responsible for tax collection, legal administration, and economic policy, affecting thousands of people. The appointment was celebrated throughout their social circle as evidence of the merit system working properly, the son of the chief examiner succeeding based purely on his own abilities, with no favoritism shown despite his father's position. Dev received congratulations for maintaining his principles, even when his own child was involved. But lying in bed that night, listening to celebration sounds drifting from the main house where Rohan was hosting friends who had come to congratulate him on his success, Dev felt the weight of what he had done settling into his bones like a cold that would never leave. He had not only corrupted the examination process, he had corrupted his son. Rohan would begin his career believing he had succeeded through merit when he had actually succeeded through advantage. He would face responsibilities he was not fully prepared for, make decisions affecting other people's lives without the complete competency his position required. The seeds Dev had planted to help his son would grow into challenges that might ultimately destroy him. Worse, Dev realized that his corruption of this single examination had damaged the entire system he had spent 15 years building. Other candidates who had been more qualified than Rohan had been rejected because they lacked the hidden advantages his position had provided. Families who had trusted the merit system to evaluate their children fairly had been betrayed. The kingdom would be governed by administrators chosen through compromised rather than pure evaluation. Over the following months, as Rohan began his administrative duties, the consequences of Dev's choices became visible in ways he had never anticipated. His son struggled with responsibilities he was not fully prepared for, making decisions that revealed gaps in his knowledge and judgment. Complaints began filtering back to the capital about the new assistant governor's questionable policies and inadequate understanding of local conditions. More troubling, other candidates who had been rejected in Rohan's year began questioning whether the examination process had been conducted fairly. Rumors started circulating that the chief examiner had shown favoritism to his own son, that the merit system had been corrupted by the very person charged with maintaining its integrity. Dev found himself in the impossible position of defending an examination process he knew had been compromised while maintaining public confidence in a system he had personally corrupted. Each defense felt like another lie, each reassurance about the process's integrity another step away from the truth he could never safely reveal. The crisis deepened when several rejected candidates formally requested review of their examination results, claiming they had been unfairly evaluated. The requests were procedurally valid and politically sensitive. Rejecting them would appear to confirm suspicions about corruption, while granting them might reveal evidence of the favoritism Dev had shown his son. As Dev sat in his office reviewing files from the disputed examinations, comparing the rejected candidates' qualifications to those of successful applicants, including his son, he saw clearly for the first time how completely his single act of favoritism had undermined everything he had built. The rejected candidates were, in several cases, more qualified than Rohan. Their examination answers were more insightful, their oral presentations more impressive, their overall preparation more thorough. They had been rejected not because they lacked merit, but because they lacked the hidden advantage of having the chief examiner as their father. Looking at these files, Dev realized he faced a choice that would determine not only his career, but his fundamental understanding of who he was. He could continue defending the compromised examination results, protecting his son's position while maintaining the lie that had made it possible. Or he could acknowledge what he had done, accepting the consequences that would destroy not only his career, but his son's future and his family's reputation. The weight of this choice pressed down on him like a mountain, but beneath the pressure, Dev began to feel something he had not experienced since the night he first decided to help his son, a clarity that came from seeing truth without the distortion of rationalization or self-interest. Late that evening, Dev walked to his son's quarters and found Rohan working at his desk, struggling with administrative problems that revealed the gaps in his preparation. Documents were scattered around him like evidence of challenges he could not quite master, policies he could not quite understand, decisions he could not quite make with confidence. "Father," Rohan said, looking up with relief at the interruption. "I'm glad you're here. This taxation issue is more complex than I expected, and I'm not certain how to proceed." Dev looked at his son, earnest, well-meaning, trying hard to fulfill responsibilities he had not truly earned, and felt the full weight of what his attempt to help had actually cost. He had not given Rohan success. He had given him a position he was not ready for, challenges he was not prepared to meet, a career built on a foundation of deception that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own falseness. "Son," Dev said quietly, settling into the chair across from Rohan's desk. "There is something I need to tell you about your examination results, something that will be difficult for both of us to face. This story shows us how the threads that connect our actions to our fate are stronger than any love we bear for those we try to help through dishonest means." Dev discovered that corruption intended to benefit another person ultimately harms them more deeply than honest failure would have done. The Buddha taught that the seeds we plant in darkness grow into forests that overshadow not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone we touch. When we try to spare those we love from the consequences of their limitations, we plant seeds that bloom into challenges they are even less prepared to face. Take a gentle breath with me now, feeling the air move through you like a soft breeze carrying away any heaviness from these teachings. Notice how your body rests, supported by the understanding that love expressed through truth, though sometimes difficult, serves others better than love expressed through deception. Let your shoulders release, your breathing soften, as these ancient wisdoms settle into your heart, like seeds finding their proper depth in prepared soil. We are approaching the end of our journey together tonight, having explored the invisible threads that connect every choice to its consequence, every action to its fruit, every seed planted in darkness to its eventual blooming in light. Through these stories, we have seen how the universe maintains perfect accounts, recording not just what we do, but what we intend, not just how we appear, but who we actually are beneath our carefully constructed presentations to the world. The merchant Tarun learned that silver cannot lie, that promises made in love carry their own weight and their own truth, regardless of distance or temptation. The grain inspector Bharat discovered that we cannot poison others without eventually poisoning ourselves and those we most wish to protect. The weaver Kira found that excellence admits no compromise, that small concessions to convenience grow into great collapses of everything we have built. The trader Vikram saw how reputation constructed on truth cannot survive even minor deceptions, how integrity once cracked shows every flaw to the light. The record keeper Anjali understood how corruption spreads like water through stone, weakening foundations we never realized supported everything we valued. And now, through Dev's story, we see how love itself can become corrupted when it tries to shield others from the honest consequences of their own choices and limitations. All of these teachings point toward the same profound understanding that nothing we do exists in isolation, that every choice creates ripples that spread far beyond our ability to control or predict, that the universe operates according to laws more perfect and more compassionate than any we could devise with our limited perspective. The threads that connect our actions to their consequences are woven from the same fabric as the threads that connect us to each other, that bind us to the natural world, that link our present choices to our future circumstances. When we tug on one thread through compromise or deception, we create tension throughout the entire web that supports our lives and the lives of everyone around us. But these stories also reveal the profound mercy that lies at the heart of existence. The universe's perfect accounting is not punishment, but education, not condemnation, but opportunity for growth and understanding. Every consequence carries within it the seeds of wisdom. Every failure contains the potential for deeper success. Every collapse creates space for something more authentic and more beautiful to grow. The ring can be polished with genuine tears, but only when those tears flow from complete honesty about what caused the tarnishing. The poisoned grain can be replaced with wholesome food, but only after we acknowledge how the poison entered our stores. The workshop can be purified by burning what carries compromise, but only when we are willing to start again with nothing but truth and commitment. The reputation can be rebuilt on authentic foundations, but only after we confess how the original foundation was damaged. The corruption can be cleansed from our systems, but only through transparency that may cost us everything we thought we needed to protect. The path of return is always available, always possible, but it demands something our compromises have made increasingly difficult to give: the courage to face the full truth of what we have done and who we have become in the process of doing it. This courage grows not from strength, but from understanding that living with lies requires more energy than living with truth, that carrying secrets creates more burden than bearing consequences, that protecting false reputations demands more effort than rebuilding authentic ones. Let your breathing slow now, feeling each exhale carry away any burden these stories might have stirred. Notice how your body settles deeper into rest as you release the weight of carrying secrets, the exhaustion of maintaining false appearances, the constant vigilance that deception requires. There is a lightness that comes with truth, a peace that flows from alignment between what we do and what we claim about what we do. In the silence that follows these teachings, perhaps you can feel the threads that connect your own choices to their consequences, the invisible web of cause and effect that supports every aspect of your life. Perhaps you can sense the places where small compromises have created tension in that web, where minor deceptions have weakened the foundation that everything else depends upon. If you find such places, know that they are not permanent damage, but opportunities for healing. Every thread that has been stretched can be restored to its proper tension through honest acknowledgement and authentic correction. Every foundation that has been weakened can be strengthened through actions that prove words true rather than clever. The universe is endlessly forgiving of our mistakes, but it is absolutely uncompromising in its demand that we learn from them. The consequences that flow from our choices are not punishment, but education, not condemnation, but invitation to understand more clearly how the great web of existence actually functions. When we align our actions with this understanding, when we choose truth over convenience and integrity over advantage, we discover something remarkable, that the universe supports authentic living with a generosity that makes our small deceptions seem not just unnecessary, but pathetically inadequate. The energy we spent maintaining false appearances becomes available for creating genuine beauty. The intelligence we used for rationalization transforms into wisdom that serves not just ourselves, but everyone whose lives we touch. Take another gentle breath, feeling your body supported by forces more reliable than any reputation we could construct through careful management of appearances. You are held by the same laws that govern the movement of stars and the growth of seeds, the same principles that ensure consequences follow actions as surely as rivers flow toward the sea. Let your jaw soften, your shoulders release, as you rest in the knowledge that you are part of something infinitely larger and more trustworthy than any system of deception or advantage-seeking you could devise. The web that connects all things operates according to principles of perfect justice, tempered by infinite compassion. Laws that serve the highest good, even when we cannot understand how our particular circumstances fit into the larger pattern. Feel your breathing becoming slower, deeper, as these teachings settle into your body like medicine, working at levels deeper than conscious thought. The stories you have heard tonight are working in you now, not as intellectual concepts, but as living wisdom that will guide your choices and illuminate your path long after the words themselves are forgotten. Your eyelids are growing heavier now, your thoughts becoming softer, as you allow yourself to rest in the peace that comes from understanding rather than struggling, from accepting rather than resisting the fundamental laws that govern how choices become consequences and actions become fate. The threads that seemed invisible are becoming visible. The accounts that seemed hidden are revealing themselves. The seeds that were planted in darkness are ready to bloom in whatever light you choose to shine upon them. This is not a burden, but a gift. The opportunity to live consciously, to choose deliberately, to plant seeds you will be glad to see flower in the garden of your future. Rest now in this understanding. Let your body sink deeper into whatever supports you, feeling the solid presence of truth beneath all the shifting appearances of daily life. There is something unshakable at the core of existence, something that cannot be compromised or corrupted, something that responds to honesty with such reliability that truth-telling becomes not a burden, but a homecoming. Your breathing is becoming rhythmic now, natural, like the breathing of deep sleep, but with awareness still gently present. Feel how each inhale draws in peace. Each exhale releases anything that needs to be let go. The stories have done their work. The teachings have found their mark. The ancient wisdom has taken root in soil prepared by your willingness to listen deeply. In this state between waking and sleeping, you might notice how the weight of carrying secrets begins to lift, how the exhaustion of maintaining false appearances starts to ease. There is a lightness that comes with alignment, a peace that flows from integrity, a rest that is only possible when we are at home with ourselves exactly as we are. Let this feeling of lightness spread through your body like warm water, relaxing muscles that have been tensed by the effort of being someone other than who you actually are. Feel how your face softens when it no longer needs to maintain expressions that hide your true thoughts. How your voice would sound if it never had to say words that contradict your actual beliefs. This is what authenticity feels like in the body. Not the dramatic authenticity of conflict and confrontation, but the quiet authenticity of simple alignment between inner truth and outer expression. It is as natural as breathing, as peaceful as deep water, as reliable as sunrise. The threads that connect your actions to their consequences are relaxing now, no longer stretched tight by the tension between what you do and what you claim about what you do. The web that supports your life is finding its natural balance, each strand settling into its proper relationship with all the others. Feel this settling happening in your body, in your mind, in the part of you that knows things without thinking them, that understands without explaining. You are being supported by laws more trustworthy than any you could devise, held by arms stronger than any reputation you could build, guided by wisdom more reliable than any rationalization you could construct. Your thoughts are becoming dreamlike now, floating rather than grasping, suggesting rather than demanding. The urgent voice that usually provides commentary on everything you experience is growing quieter, making space for a deeper kind of knowing to emerge. In this space, you might begin to sense the presence of something vast and patient and utterly trustworthy. The intelligence that ensures consequences follow actions. The love that makes consequences educational rather than merely punitive. The wisdom that weaves individual choices into patterns that serve purposes larger than any one person could imagine. This presence is not separate from you, but is the deepest truth of what you are beneath all the stories you tell about yourself, all the roles you play, all the reputations you try to maintain. It is the part of you that cannot be corrupted, because it is made of the same consciousness that governs stars and seasons, the same awareness that ensures seeds bloom and rivers find the sea. Rest in this presence now, feeling held and known, and completely safe to be exactly who you are, without any need to explain or justify or improve. The work of these stories has been completed. The teachings have found their home in your understanding. The ancient wisdom has been planted in soil that will nurture it through whatever seasons lie ahead. Your body is completely relaxed now, supported by this deeper knowing, cradled in the peace that comes from understanding how perfectly everything fits together when seen from the proper perspective. The threads that connect all things are visible now, not as constraints, but as the very fabric of love made manifest in the physical world. Feel yourself sinking deeper into this understanding, letting it hold you completely as you release any need to figure out what it means or how to use it. Truth does not need to be managed or manipulated. It simply needs to be lived, one choice at a time, one moment at a time, one breath at a time. The merchants and weavers and grain inspectors of these stories are settling into peace now, alongside you. Their lessons learned, their wisdom earned through experience you can benefit from without having to repeat their mistakes. They have traveled the difficult paths, so you can see more clearly which directions lead toward flourishing and which directions lead toward collapse. Their stories become part of your stories now. Their hard-won understanding becomes part of your inheritance. Their return to integrity becomes part of your own path home to authenticity. You carry forward not just the information they discovered, but the living wisdom they embodied after learning what happens when truth is abandoned and how it feels when truth is reclaimed. Let this inherited wisdom work in you now, like seeds planted in fertile darkness, growing without effort or attention, developing according to their own perfect timing into whatever forms will best serve your particular path and circumstances. You do not need to remember the details of these stories, only to live in ways that honor what they have taught you about the invisible threads that connect choices to consequences. Your breathing has become the breathing of deep sleep now, natural and slow, carrying you deeper into rest that restores not just your body, but your soul, that heals not just your fatigue, but your capacity to live with integrity in a world that often rewards deception. Feel yourself being held by something infinitely patient and completely trustworthy, something that has been waiting your entire life for you to rest deeply enough to sense its presence. This is not a force outside yourself, but the deepest truth of what you are, the part of you that knows without doubt which choices serve life and which choices diminish it. The stories fade now into the deeper truth they pointed toward, becoming like dreams that leave their essence behind while releasing their specific forms. What remains is understanding rather than information, wisdom rather than knowledge, peace rather than cleverness. In this peace, you are already living the lessons these stories taught. You are already choosing truth over convenience, integrity over advantage, authentic difficulty over deceptive ease. Not through effort or struggle, but through the natural movement of consciousness that has remembered its own nature and wants nothing more than to express that nature through every choice and action. Rest completely now, held by laws more reliable than gravity, supported by love more constant than sunrise, guided by wisdom more trustworthy than any you could devise through thinking. The threads that seemed invisible have become visible. The accounts that seemed hidden have revealed themselves. The seeds that were planted in darkness have found their proper light. You are exactly where you belong, exactly who you need to be, exactly as prepared as you can be for whatever choices await you tomorrow. The ancient teachings have done their work. The stories have delivered their gifts. The wisdom has found its home in understanding that needs no words to express itself. Sleep well, knowing that you are held by the same consciousness that ensures consequences follow actions, that makes truth ultimately more powerful than deception, that guarantees integrity will always find its way back to itself, even after the longest journey through compromise and confusion. The universe keeps perfect accounts, but those accounts are written in love rather than judgment, designed for education rather than punishment, intended to guide souls home to themselves rather than to condemn them for losing their way. You are home now, in this moment, in this breath, in this peace that passes understanding. Everything that needs to be done has been done. Everything that needs to be learned has been learned. Everything that needs to be released has been released. Simply rest now in the knowledge that truth is more reliable than deception, that integrity creates less burden than compromise, that the shortest path between any 2 points is always the path that honors what is real rather than what is convenient. The threads connect all things in patterns of perfect beauty. The accounts balance with mathematical precision, softened by infinite mercy. The seeds bloom in their proper season into exactly the wisdom each soul needs to take its next step toward home. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us at Sleepy Monk.